living, like you could support a family on it. So she thought she was marrying rich. She figured that out later, quite rich, but but she was marrying a lot better than this, essentially, what was going on. So that's what tenant farming basically is. So what does this do? What does this create in the South? It has, I told first period, I should have used my word at the beginning, my dramatic word. Sharecropping and tenant farming is an insidious system in the South.
It's a bad move.
What does it mean if something is insidious? It's evil, and it's what? Evil in a way you don't really see and understand and know at first, and by the time you know how evil it is, it's too late to change anything about it, you're already doing it. That's what insidious means, right? It doesn't go away. That's insidious. And this is insidious, because what does it mean happens to people? What are they stuck in? A never-ending cycle of debt and poverty. Y'all, those 7, 8, 9, 10 children people have are going to have to what in this system? They're going to have to work, which means they are not going to be able to go to school. You're not going to be able to go to school and be a sharecropper's kid, which is why it's such a big deal in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when southern states finally start passing laws saying children must go to school. Compulsory attendance laws were for things like this. If there wasn't a law saying you had to send your children to school, people didn't, right? Didn't think it was important. Why do I need to go to school if this is what I'm going to be doing the rest of my life, right? Why do I go to school if this is what the future is? They didn't necessarily see that if I go to school, this might not be the future, right? That's part of the insidiousness of the system. It also kept people what? Growing cash crops like cotton, no matter how bad things got. We'll connect this back, talk about making connections across history. We will connect this to the Great Depression. One of the basic causes of the Great Depression is the failure of agriculture in this country. And the failure of agriculture is not because they didn't produce, it's because they produced way too much of everything. Right? And that drives prices down, and people can't make a living, and people can't buy stuff, and the whole economy falls apart. Right? So all of this gets connected. It's insidious in so many ways. Socially, it's insidious. My mother, give you one more story, just kind of get this idea in your head. Socially, so this is the economic system, right? My mother was much smarter than me, okay? And I say that because she went through college with this kind of like living in a house without running water, and she made all A's, like all the way through school. And this was back in the day when teachers didn't give extra credit, and they won't ever retest it, right? Okay. She made A's. Not a single person at her high school, not a single teacher, not a single counselor ever suggested to her she'd think about going to college. Why? Because the sharecroppers kids. The sharecroppers kids don't go to college. Why would they? Right? Okay, so you don't even think about that. In her third grade class, she had a mean teacher in third grade, apparently. Third grade, well, you can imagine. My mother had, when she was in third grade, she had 7 brothers and sisters. And believe it or not, my grandparents, her parents were like the most stable of that whole like extended family. Remember, sharecroppers have big families. The kids, if you have 10 kids, and they have 10 kids, and they have a lot of people. So my grandparents were actually the more stable of the family, and so people would send their children to live with them.
Oh my
You're
God.
already a sharecropper, but you're going to take other people's kids in, because that's what you did. So at one point, there were like 15 kids living in my mom's house. These houses typically had 3 rooms. Kitchen, living room, and 2 bedrooms. Yeah, 15 kids. So my grandmother would get up in the morning and what? She'd cook breakfast. Whatever she could, biscuits, molasses, whatever you could afford. And your lunch that day was anything left over from breakfast or dinner the night before. Well, what was left over if you had 15 people in the house? Nothing. So my mother went to school without lunch pretty much every day. They didn't have any money, so she couldn't buy lunch. She didn't eat anything at school. So her third grade teacher saw this happening, and my mother was a little sassy. I know you can't imagine that. A little prideful, a little sassy. So her third grade teacher made her get up in front of class one day to explain to her classmates why she couldn't eat at school. Knowing why she couldn't eat at school. Totally just evil. I don't know, it's just horrible.
That was insidious.
Yes. That's part of the insidiousness of the system. This teacher, of course, was not from a sharecropper's family, right? And she was what? She was putting my mother in her place. Making sure my mother knew her place. Because my mother was prideful, right? And smart. And so my mother stood up in front of class and said, what? I don't eat at school because the food is not good.
Oh.
Right? My mother was going to stand. Everybody in the room knew why my mother. They knew how my mother dressed. She had like three changes of clothes. That was it. I mean, they knew how poor she was. But she was never going to stand in front of my classroom and say that, right? So the teacher didn't get very far with that. I think she got more spankings than anything that year at school. They still spank children. At school. And that's it. They didn't spank her for not eating.
I can see Miss Griffin try to spank. Miss Griffin will spank us. She can look back at the face.
Stop
Gotta see one.
Alright, okay, so, we may have gone too far in the other direction, I agree. But the point is what? This does not ultimately just affect economy, it also affects society. So you end up in the South now with a whole new social class of people, rich white people at the top, middle class white people who own their own farms, like my dad's family, right? Not rich, but not poor, they can support themselves. And then before you get to African Americans socially, there was this huge class of extremely poor white people that segregation tries to make sure, think they have nothing in common with the poor black people, who they are entirely the same as in terms of how they're treated and their opportunities. But they don't see it because white people can run around saying, what, at least I'm white. At least I'm not black. And believe me, my grandfather did. My poor sharecropper grandfather believed that.
Yeah, one thing.
He was racist that way. Somehow my mother got past all of that. I don't know, I credit my mother with a lot. She got past the racism, she understood that. Like, she said she didn't get the whole black-white thing until they went to school the first time, because they lived on a farm like this, and she was a white family, and most of the other families were black families, and they played together, and they grew up together, and they worked together. And then they went to school in kindergarten, and they didn't go to school with her. She's like, where are they? Why are they going to school? That's when her mother and father tried to explain to her they weren't as good as her because they were black. And my mother was like, wait a minute. I think they live in the same house. Like I said, she was my mother is very smart. Luckily, she figured that out and didn't raise us.
Play with other black children?
Yeah, they did. I mean, they didn't go, there wasn't much time to play. But yeah, they can hang out with them. But they couldn't go anywhere, like if they were out in public, like in town, they could. My mother read when she could get little.
Oh, didn't they make mud pies?
I made mud pies. You never made mud pies?
Yeah, I made tons of mud pies.
That's why all right, let's keep going. Sorry, I told you, I can't stop. So do you see why I'm mad at pageants? How do you leave this out of understanding what the South is? You cannot understand what happens in the South and the conditions people live in for the next 100 years without understanding this system. This is the root of it.
bet
Social,
Zane didn't leave it out.
economic, political factors. This is it right here, okay? My grandmother, not my grandmother, my mom's dad. I lived beside my dad. We lived on my dad's farm growing up. My dad's parents' farm. Each of the families got a little piece of land to build a house on. So we lived on their farm. So I was with that grandmother a lot more. And she's sweet, sweet. I love her. I miss her dearly, like every day of the year. But she was the grandmother who, when you got in trouble, in fact, I didn't even know these things. Plants had other names. When I was growing up, they were the switch bushes. So if you got in trouble, she'd say, go to the switch bush. And you had to pick your own switch.
Get the thickest one you could grab, too.
If I can get the thickest
You know,
one,
you
I'm
got
gonna
a
go
good
get it.
switch bush. She could prove over. She picked out the
I
switch
grabbed
bush.
like
Much
a
worse.
twig.
Miss
The
Griffin.
thin ones, they
My
hurt.
mom was talking
They
about
hurt.
Your mom's talking about switch bushes?
Yes, and one time my Aunt Karen came back with a log because she was so scared of my grandma. She was like, is it big enough? And my grandma started laughing so hard she couldn't even spank her.
Yeah, I got a lot of spankings. But I love my grandmother, love her dearly.
My mama beat me in the middle of one.
Alright, hold on. We're degenerating into chaos.
Like, my dad got mad about Adrian Peterson for taking the switch to
Oh my
his
God,
kid.
dude.
My dad was like, everybody got to switch.
Oh, got mad about them getting in trouble?
Yeah.
Yeah, that case. Now, there was, like, I got spanked a lot by a lot of people. Spanking had rules. Like, my dad spanked me when I was little one time, apparently when I was trying to get away. So he was, like, holding my arm and spanking me at the same time, and I wasn't being still, so he hit me in the back. And apparently my grandmother almost spanked him. Like, my grandmother saw my back and said, you better not ever put a mark on that child. It's not on her butt. It better be on her body. So there are rules about spanking. You shouldn't have bruises here. This is spanking. I'm spanking too. Wooden spoons are mean.
There's a difference
Yeah.
between
Yeah, paint strip. Yeah, I have to make my child, Crowley laughed at me so hard one day. One of mine was little and he was thinking really bad. So I was trying to keep him still and he wouldn't, so it turned into a wrestling match. And it was like this. What are you talking about? Like, you can't spank little children. Yeah, it's possible. All right. Let's talk about the end of Reconstruction. We're telling embarrassing stories that are being videotaped.
Yeah, the one day you decide to tell stories.
I'm too late. My mother did believe in something. Yes, that was something.
I told my mom, I'm not spanking my children.
You're not?
No.
You ain't having it.
Why did you be frustrated?
I said that too until like my 3-year-old threw a rock and hit a neighbor's car. It's the only way. And I back up right there.
So it's
You laugh about it. I was so mad at that child. He did. Our neighbor, they were driving by. He was like, from me to her. All right, sorry. Like I said, you have not had a child yet.
You can't say that to me.
I had a choke.
All right, end of Reconstruction. All right, so election of 1876 comes along. Grant, and we are going to talk about Grant some more when we come back to the next unit. Grant had been president from 1868 to 1876 because he was a big war hero, right? His administrations were wrought with corruption. He was not corrupt. He was drunk a lot. But he wasn't corrupt, but his friends were.
He was drunk.
Okay, and he put all his friends in political office because of the spoils system, and they were all corrupt and made him look bad. He walked the floors a lot, and somebody said, "What's wrong? Are your enemies after you?" People, he's like, "It's not my enemies I have to worry about. It's my friends." Okay, they're the ones that make me crazy. So he started running in 1876 because he's already served 2 terms, and everybody wants to fix the corruption. So 2 new people are nominated, people you really haven't heard of. This guy, the Democrat, is Samuel Tilden. And this guy, the Republican, is a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes. Okay? Both have reputations as reformers, all of that. And none of the election actually ends up, that doesn't matter at all. Okay? The election's all about reforming the government and getting rid of the spoils system and getting rid of corruption. And the election, that has no impact on the outcome whatsoever, ultimately. Okay? It's one of those elections where something else happens. The something else that happens is these 3 states. All right? There are 3 critical states in the election of 1876. South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. All the other southern states, okay, so the other 10, not including Tennessee, which had already been restored, all the other southern states had been restored to the Union. Congress had accepted them back. They had ratified the amendments, written a new constitution, blah, 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 blah. And over the course of 3 or 4 years, all of these state governments had come under the control of who? Who took them over? Southern Democrats. Because what happens when a state is restored? Who is no longer left in that state to protect it? Union troops are taken out. So military reconstruction ends when you're restored. Troops are taken out, which means the KKK has free reign to make sure black people don't vote. And then white Democrats take over and pass all the laws to ensure black people have no rights. That had already happened in all southern states except these 3 by 1876. Okay? These 3 states were approaching Reconstruction. We've already talked about what? By 1872, people in the North were just kind of tired of it, right? Kind of wanted it to be over. And the radicals kept holding on to it. We've got these 3 states that are left that have not been restored. So when the election rolls around, and elections are held in all the states, and they count the electoral votes, Samuel Tilden is 1 electoral vote away from being declared president. He's 1 away from a majority. He needs 1 vote from one of these states to be president. But in these 3 states, when they hold elections, they are contested elections. Democrats say we should be restored, and if we are restored and Democratic votes count, Democrats win in each state. So a group of Democrats in each of these states gets together and says, we're the government of the state, and they send in electors for the Democratic Party, Samuel Tilden. Republican leaders in the state say, wait a minute, you haven't been restored. So Republicans get together and they send in electors who vote for the Republican. So South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana send in 2 sets of votes, basically. Republicans basically stand up and say, well, Congress hasn't restored these, so we're going to count the Republican votes. Democrats respond by saying, if you do, we will filibuster the outcome of everything Democrats do. Well, you will do nothing. We will filibuster everything. We will stop the government from functioning. And so what do Democratic leaders and Republican leaders do? They get together and they make a compromise. Because what do Republican leaders know about feelings in the North?
They can be hurt easily.
Over.
Never know.